You are now in a breakout room. I'm here. Okay. Are other people able to hear me laughing? Oh dear. Are we starting?
Yes, go ahead, David.
Oh, okay.
I think
Good
everyone's
afternoon,
here.
everybody. I'm sorry for my technological deficiencies. I'm David Paris. I'm a senior advisor for the Civic Learning and Democracy Engagement Coalition. And thank you for coming to this concurrent panel, tracking and reporting students' participation and gains from civic learning and democracy engagement. In the last session, I counted at least 4 mentions of the necessity for assessing our efforts at upping our game, so to speak, in terms of student engagement, civic education. Now, the question of assessment, as anybody who's had even modest experience with assessment knows, raises a lot of questions at many levels, as well as gives a lot of people shivers. But for this session, what I'd like to do is pretend a little that we are going to narrow our focus and think about what would it mean for us to do this kind of assessment, and particularly what would key performance indicators look like. And what I think, what I hope will happen is this panel can help us take the first steps in that direction in really beginning to get closer to the idea of key performance indicators and talking about what they might be, how we might find them, how we might use them. And to help us with that, we have a panel that involves an organization, a report, and an emerging measure that I think separately and together could combine to give us some guidance as we start moving into this territory. So let me briefly introduce our panelists, and you'll find their full bios in the chat. Charles Ansell, who will be here shortly, I'm told. He better be, because he's presenting.
In fact, I'm already here.
There he is. Vice President for Research, Policy, and Advocacy, Complete College America. He's also the co-chair of our working group on documenting students' CLD participation and gains. And he's the lead author of a forthcoming report from CCA that links student success and the impact of civic engagement practices. Deirdre Hawkins and Iona Hulbert are from Ithaca, S+R, co-authors of the report Assessing the Civic Campus, the Link Between Higher Education and Democracy. It's a publication from ASCU, the American Association of State Colleges and Universities. And it's a landscape review of studies and findings on the link between higher education, civic engagement, and democratic attitudes and behavior. Jillian Kinsey, Associate Director, Indiana University Center for Post-Secondary Research in the National Study of Student Engagement, known to us all as NSSE, and is the lead developer of NSSE's Civic Engagement module, which institutions can use, and it's relatively new, can use to document students' gains from civic learning and democracy engagement. Now, what I'm going to do is ask each of them a question or two about their work and their views about the issues we're facing in developing key performance indicators. With each speaker, we will put in a resource or 2 or 3, pointing you to things that are relevant to their discussion. After the 3 presentations, we'll bring the group back together for a few minutes to discuss what we've heard and perhaps answer more questions. You're welcome, ask and answer more questions. You're welcome to submit questions to us in the chat as we go along, and we'll address them as time permits. So let's start with Charles. The CCA's focus on data and tracking has led to its considerable influence and success in changing policies and programs to increase completion rates. Could you say a little bit about CCA's philosophy and approach to performance measures in doing this?
Yeah. Thanks, David. And everybody, you can hear me, right? You can hear me okay? Okay, excellent.
Hear you.
Yeah, I think, just to answer your question, I actually have 2 or 3 slides that I think actually, speak to it. And so I believe Saya, you've got control of it. So if you can go to the next one. Basically when it comes to data and measurement and KPIs, like CCA's approach, I mean, we're known for our like workforce stuff, right? And I think, one of the things that we're looking to do in our forthcoming report is to make sure that we're very expansive about the purpose of college and the value of college and the value of higher education. And, I think that part of the reason that there's a huge emphasis on workforce and that we've had from the get-go is like, well, like I'm not trying to take anything away from it. I mean, most students, when you ask them why they're enrolling in higher education, particularly at community colleges, broad access, 4 years in universities and colleges, they'll say, to better myself economically, right? And at the same time, there's also more quantitative information around in terms of targets for higher education when it comes to workforce. So if I'm, hypothetically a governor of a state and I'm thinking, what do I do with higher education? Where do I want to go? What should I focus on? My first thought would be, well, how much higher education should I even have? And that's how I end up, looking at Georgetown Center for Education and the Workforce and looking at the attainment rates for my state per different job families. So I've got like 2 or 3 slides that are it's almost by way of analogy. Like the point actually isn't the substance of the slide. So to get into that. So for example, we can pull right now, obviously, around the world, what higher education attainment looks like in different countries and see where the US stacks. You can see that, for 25 to 34-year-olds, we're a little bit higher than 1 and 2 in terms of higher ed attainment. This is just degree level and above. It doesn't include certificates. And that at 55 to 64, it's a little bit lower. And so you can see that countries, there are countries that have higher education attainment rates than us, and that they are doing so in a way that is growing more rapidly over time. And the point is here, what's not on this slide, which is that we don't have a corollary outside of workforce, right? We know, for example, The Economist puts out just as one example, a democracy index, right? And the US ranks at 78%, like in the second category of flawed democracy. Well, what's higher ed's role in that? There's 5 factors that contribute to setting that target. Those can be mapped hypothetically to post-secondary, but we haven't done the research to say, well, quantitatively, this is the direct link, and these are the attainment goals that we'd have from a democracy perspective in terms of the value for higher ed. All we have is the attainment goals from a workforce perspective. So if we go to the next slide, if you were to be able to have those sorts of attainment rates, or in lieu of that, some other substantive target for civic learning and democracy engagement writ large for post-secondary, for higher ed, then you could conceivably do something like what we do at CCA for student success overall, where you have at the top layer, and I don't know if you can read it, but you can, zoom in and we can share this later, but, you can have at the top level, certain post-completion metrics that are tied more directly to democracy and civic learning and civic engagement. And then from there, well, what are the student completion components that predict those democracy top level components? What are the indicators that change every semester around, retention and credit accumulation? What would those corollaries be in the civic learning and democracy engagement realm? And then most importantly, what are the things that change, every day or every week that can measure that? So if you go to the next slide, and this is the final slide that I have, but just to kind of put a fine point on it, is that there are plenty of non-economic benefits, of course, to higher education that are sometimes positioned as afterthoughts, right? Well, in addition to all these workforce outcomes, we want to make sure that we can maximize voting and volunteering and health and well-being outcomes that are associated with this. But we should treat these with the same level of rigor, measurement, discipline, and detailed approach as we do on the workforce side. And then that would allow us to not just have, bottom up and one-off efforts to track how we're doing on civic learning and democracy engagement, but actually work it backwards from a top level goal that would be analogous to what we already do on the economic or workforce side. So I apologize that was a lot and I was going kind of quick, and I do hope that there's questions and comments later, but that's my answer to your first question, David. And I think that's it on any slides that I'd want to share.
Yeah, I've got 2 other questions.
Okay.
One is you mentioned the corollaries to the second slide, and I know that's some way off, or maybe not, for what we're going to reach. But what do you think a corollary might, maybe even just one corollary that might appear in a similar kind of chart or table?
Yeah, so I'll answer that in two ways. So one is I almost want to like take your question and like put it in front of Jillian when she goes to her portion, because I think that, you know, we have these sort of like, you know, bottom up pockets. Or I don't mean it that's but I think you know what I mean, Jillian, where it's like, you know, these are the we're almost tracking already at a lower level and just not making the connection to the higher level target. And so part of what I'm saying is that like we can't galvanize a movement without having these top level targets like we already have out of Georgetown in economics. And so, you know, sample corollaries, I think, would tie to, you know, if you were to map back, well, these are the ways that higher education promotes democracy, as opposed to just here's the civic learning and democracy engagement service learning projects that end up improving graduation rates. But flipping that situation, then you would come up with leading indicators of those. Well, you know, how many students are graduating having taken those programs that move the needle on that? How many students have graduated that have engaged in certain civic engagement activities beyond just say like a voting registration drive? And then how does that translate on a per semester basis? And then how does that translate into the advising office, into the classroom? And I think that that's also, unless I'm misspeaking, Jillian, kind of where your portion's at, right? So I think we've almost got the bottom layer a little bit more fleshed out than the top layer, which is kind of odd. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. It does. And I guess we'll maybe try Jillian out on that question. What would be the process whereby the bottom layer moves to the top? And if you have any thoughts on that as well, but you've already given us. The other question I have is I'd like to let you have the floor for kind of an advertisement, or at least to talk about the forthcoming publication CCA is offering, and how that has changed in some way the agenda of CCA and broadened it in this direction.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. You know, and I'll keep it quick, like to a minute or two. Just you know, I'm grateful for the opportunity to preview it, because you know, you know, like I said earlier, I mean, CCA is, you know, trying to make sure that, you know, when we're talking about student purpose and we're talking about structured student experience and momentum to college completion, that we're doing so in a way that embraces, like, you know, the full value of higher education beyond just economic outcomes. And when we were looking at, you know, student success and its relationship to civic learning and democracy engagement, you know, the core thesis of the report that's coming out, you know, I would say, you know, not to be grandiose about it, but I think it's both sobering and urgent, because when higher education fails, democracy fails. We found that the challenges that are plaguing our higher education system and the crisis facing American democracy are deeply interconnected. And, you know, our report essentially outlines that sort of troubling reality, that we have a two-tiered higher education system. It perpetuates both privilege and inequity. A small number of elite institutions prepare a select few for lives of leadership and influence, while the vast majority of students, particularly those from historically excluded backgrounds, navigate underfunded public colleges while essentially incurring mounting debt. And that divide has profound implications for our democracy. And so we outline that with a lot of, you know, data points, and try to bolster our thesis by saying that when higher ed reinforces rather than decreases economic polarization, it's actually undermining the very foundations of a participatory democracy. And frankly, that we're seeing this play out in real time. So I want to make sure that I give other people, you know, a chance. So I'll wrap up my little advertising preview for this by saying that, you know, higher ed clearly has a crucial role to play in renewing American democracy, and by closing equity gaps, and by integrating civic learning across the curriculum, and by ensuring that all students have the opportunity to develop the skills and knowledge needed for effective citizenship and not just the economic outcomes, then, you know, CCA is trying to make the case that that's how we build a higher education system, you know, that truly serves as an engine for democracy. So sorry if that was a, you know, a little.
No, that's a really powerful message that needs to be heard. And I think it really reinforces the reason for this movement that we're working on, all of us who are present here today.
And David,
in the chat, you will find a couple of links. One is to a CCA document about managing data, and the other is to study that Lynn Pasquarella mentioned, that Ashley Finley did about the positive effects of civic engagement activities on a number of outcomes. And I think it's worth reading because it's accessible, and it could help at your institution around your campus, help make the case for this and actually buttress the kind of thing that Charles just described. And I think that our next speaker can also provide information about gaps that's relevant to the point that Charles just made. So, Joanna, thank you for being part of this panel. This summer, your organization, in conjunction with ASCU, published a report assessing the civic campus, the link between higher education and democracy. Can you tell us a little bit about the report? Give us a kind of quick summary of what you think are the most important points. I know you have a slide that maybe that can help make it give us the view of it.
So I'll take that question.
Oh, Deirdre.
No worries. No worries. I was pretty quiet in the prep call, so
Surprise.
But yeah, I just wanted to give just super brief description of our organization. It's like a sentence. But so it's so nice to be here with all of you. And so Ithaca S&R is a nonprofit research organization that does research to advance access to education, and we do work with other cultural institutions. And one really simplistic way that I'm sure everyone that I work with is sick of hearing me say, that I like to describe our organization is that we're a sister company to JSTOR, and that's like the only way that people really know who we are. But other than that, but no, to answer your question, yeah, thank you so much for that question. So we started collaborating with ASCU on this project last fall, actually, and in January we began the research to assess the link between civic engagement, higher education, and democratic participation in the form of a landscape review, like you said. And so through this, we wanted to shed light on the role that post-secondary education plays in upholding democratic attitudes and behaviors within the United States, particularly due to the role that universities play in fostering ideas on campus. And so one thing that we found interesting pertaining to this specific research question about how researchers have defined, operationalized, and measured civic engagement, we found that in all the literature that we read, that there was a split between those who use civic, political, citizen, democratic, and community engagement. They use it interchangeably. There's no one clear definition of civic engagement. People argue that they're very similar, and people argue that they're very distinct. There wasn't a clear consensus. In one article, it was even noted that there were as many as 48 different terms to use to capture community engagement activities in higher education. In our research, we also found that in the 70s and 80s, civic engagement was synonymous with student volunteerism. But in the 90s, the term began applying to service learning and more academic activities. We also found in our research that definitions of civic engagement can also be influenced by larger political landscapes, specifically with the rise of political polarization, with research showing variations in different ideologies around what counts as good citizenship or civicness. And then also relating to that is the demographic variations. And so we found more of this research was focused on K through 12 teachers rather than on higher education, but it did raise the question of whether the ideology of faculty members has an impact on their approach to civic education. And just to give a couple of other introductions to some of the key findings that we found, is that we found that longitudinal studies seem to be rare. And that most of the studies we came across in our research were restricted to case studies of individual campuses rather than conducting studies on the impacts of the initiatives over time. The research was more on self-reported data through attitudinal surveys, capturing civic attitudes, some capturing civic behaviors, but most research done as of now can't be generalized or replicated. And so it was unclear to us how many higher education institutions attempt to track the civic engagement of their students and alumni long term. So essentially more research is needed, of course. Just moving on from that, just a couple more, this connected to another finding from our research, that most of the existing literature was quantitative. And so most research focuses on the quantity of education. So like the number of years of post-secondary education that someone has, as opposed to the content or the actual quality of the education. And so, for example, one study that we read found that if students were exposed to or take part in, I think they said 6 high impact practices, they would engage in, I believe it was 2.5 more civic activities than students with no experience. And then closely related to this is that we found that STEM departments in particular could benefit from integrating civic engagement into their curriculum. We found that incoming undergraduates express similar levels of interest in civic engagement programming or coursework, and with preliminary research showing that STEM majors are less civically engaged than their humanities and social sciences counterparts, and overall have a lower satisfaction with civic engagement opportunities on their campuses. And I know Awana wants to talk about this a little bit more in terms of voter turnout, so I won't say too much on that, but it's much of the literature also noted that the social sciences are positively associated with higher voter turnout, with the opposite being true for graduates of STEM programs. And I feel like I said research a lot, so I'm sorry.
Did you want to hand off to Joanna at this point?
Sure. Joanna, if there's anything that I may have missed in terms of answering that question.
No. Any questions, any follow-up questions, David?
Yeah, I noticed that one of the last things Deirdre said about and it goes back to a little bit about the kind of corollaries that Charles talked about, is about participation and then the actual effect or outcome. That is, we can track, it'll be easier quantitatively to track whether in fact somebody participated in a civic engagement activity. It'll be more difficult to figure out or try to figure out whether in fact they benefited from it. What was the outcome? I mean, we can get that probably en masse, but it's going to be difficult to I mean, it's make that a question. Is it going to be difficult to have you run across in your literature review people who are beginning to build some kind of analysis of the outcomes, or is that something that just is, we can note participation, but we're not really near being able to assess the outcomes, the actual quality of what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the key findings in our report is that the literature and the research is overwhelmingly focused on voter turnout or voter intent.
Mm-hmm.
And even that is most often sort of narrowed down to federal elections. So you lose a lot of the sort of local and regional context for a lot of this. And that makes sense, right? That is probably the easiest outcome that you can track. You can track longitudinally, right? It's harder to capture some of the civic agency kind of outcomes. It's harder to track attitudes. It's harder to track behavior that is not reduced to sort of like a binary, did you vote or did you not vote? So I think that is something that a lot of assessments that we looked at grapple with. But I think it really comes down to, you know, in our report, we really start by looking at the question of, but what is the link between higher education and civic engagement? And there are really 3 main schools of thought that kind of guide the research, guide the programming, guide how people sort of conceptualize of this relationship. So 2 of those are sort of directly causal schools of thought. The first one is that education directly sort of impacts civic engagement by giving you the actual skills to be civically engaged, to vote. It gives you literacy. It gives you access to information. It gives you sort of critical thinking skills for you to navigate your choices in society. The second one argues, well, it's direct, but it's really about socializing you into democratic norms and behaviors. You know, you go to college, you are exposed to all of these ideas. Higher education promotes certain attitudes and behaviors that correspond to a democracy. Therefore, you're gonna kind of be socialized into these norms and behaviors that are pro-social in this context. The third school of thought really says, well, it's an indirect relationship and it's kind of a spurious one, right? This third school of thought says it has not, higher education really has nothing to do with civic engagement. It's just a stand-in for socioeconomic status. So it kind of doesn't matter because the playing field was already rigged before you came to college through your parents' socioeconomic status, through your sort of political knowledge that you get at home or in your community. So higher education really doesn't make a difference in that context. So you see sort of those three threads kind of have ramifications through the research based on kind of the research questions that get asked, the programs that people developed, the assessments, right? The way that they shape questionnaires. So I think that was really interesting to see, but it still tends to treat civic engagement as a monolith, which it's really not. It comes down to agency, to behavior, to attitudes. It's not just voting, right? It's also the type of political speech, for lack of a better word, that you engage with. So certain programs that we looked at started touching upon that. So some institutions track, for example, how many of their alumni run for public office after they graduate. So that is a measure of looking towards post-graduation behaviors, longitudinal analysis. That's not just sort of how many times did you vote after you graduated as an adult, or even those studies tend to end at 26. There's also implications for the differential impact that civic education programming might have on different demographics. So we know that certain populations are understudied. Historically marginalized populations tend to be understudied in the literature. There's all sorts of points, early research that points to the fact that there might be a differential impact depending on the type of civic engagement programming that they undergo. There's also some interesting emerging research on civic deserts, right? So the idea that if you're in a rural community or maybe in an online learning environment, you don't have that kind of communal space or that kind of community that you can go engage with. So I think that that's interesting as well. And the last thing that I want to mention is, sorry, I lost my train of thought there. That one interesting research study pointed to the fact that one of the strongest predictors of high civic engagement for undergrads is really the residential status of the campus. So that was, I think that has really strong implications for sort of the type of programming that universities can come up with as well.
Yeah, and I think that's probably an important ingredient in the differentials, the gaps in civic engagement generally and its effects. And your last few remarks reminded me why Deirdre used the word research so much, is because there's a whole range of research ideas that we could pursue. One final point where you and Deirdre started off was about the multiple definitions of civic learning or engagement, and the kind of different emphases and different threads. Short commercial break. The one way that the CLDE has tried to address that question is in the learning framework. Could you drop the slide in, Saya? I'm just going to look at it. I'm not going to talk through it. I'm just going to show it to you and invite you, if you have not already seen it, to visit it. And we can put the link in the chat along with other links from this presentation, which include the Democracy Inventory Project, which looks at a kind of trying how you organize and catalog what campuses are doing, Pathways of Public Service Project, that is a Stanford program that tries to get students to see and follow different pathways and think about public service. And finally, I know NCEL, the National Center for Studying, Learning, Voting, and Engagement, that provides data and information about what activities are on campus. So there's this is the basic framework. And then if you go to and we can drop the link in there too. If you go to our website and look at that, it's got a richer discussion and indicators of what this means. So that can help the definitional conversation. So let's move on to Jillian. And Nessie's recently developed the civic engagement module that institutions can use. So tell us about it.
Yeah. Thanks, David. Thanks, everybody. The survey project that David has introduced here, Nessie, has a community college version as well. So Nessie is in the 4-year sector, and CESI, the Community College Survey of Student Engagement, is in the 2-year sector. And these surveys are designed to facilitate campus action and improvement on data about the quality of students' experience. So we've been around for a long time, and it's 25 years, in fact, but we have more recently, actually, I should say, David, that the first survey of civic engagement that we created was way back in 2013, and we have freshened it. So I like to think of this as the fresh civic engagement survey. So, Sai, I'll let you advance to the next slide. Before I get started on some numerical information, I want to make sure that we bring students' comments in the room here, because I think that they're just an important reflection and something that we also need to keep track of. As much as I know that numerical information is really important to keep track of, I want to make sure that we also track what students are saying about the quality of their experience in civic engagement. And if you want to click on the next two, it's slightly animated here. So we invite students at the end of the survey to comment on the meaning that their civic experiences have made to them. So what meaning does this have? And, I think you can learn a lot about the kinds of experiences students value by looking at an open-ended comment like that. So I think there's a lot to be learned on this. We have probably about 20,000 comments from this past year alone. So there's a lot of information about what students value, and what this suggests to me is some benefit of maybe doing an analysis of what we see in these results. And one of the things that I take from my quick review of, this is just a sampling of comments, is how much what's the meaning that students make of their experience takes all forms. In some ways, it's about a course level experience that provided them a civic engagement opportunity. Others talk about co-curricular experiences, and others talk about experiential learning in the form of internships or a service learning opportunity. So there's a variety of different forms that students value. So I like to start with that and encourage our thinking about what students value in their experiences. But meanwhile, we have a survey with lots of data. So I'll ask you to go to the next one, where I want to suggest that there are 2 batches of information that we've been tracking over time. One comes, so the first section you'll see here comes from our civic learning dimensions that have been on the core part of the Nessie survey since its inception, that asks students about connecting their learning to societal problems, the extent to which they get to do service learning, the extent to which they're attending events that are about important social, economic, and political issues. So those are items that are already part of our core survey. And Sai, if you could show the, again, there's a little animation here. The next 2, you can just bring them both up, it's fine. So the core survey represents civic learning, and then the engagement topical module offers a specialized set of items that ask students more directly and explicitly about their experiences. So this is the part that has been freshened, and we have aligned it with the civic learning and democracy engagement framework, what David just showed you in the illustration or in the diagram. But before I get to that alignment, I do want to kind of apply our own classification to how we think about these measures. So say in the next one, again, it's an animated 4-part little thing. So 4 clicks. The first one is about civic environment. There are measures that get at the civic environment on a campus, one that asks about, or a group of questions that ask about students' civic experiences. And those are probably things we can, that are easier to count, like how much have you attended events? How much have you participated in service learning? And then there are civic practices and mindset questions that really get more at the learning practices. So students becoming informed about civic issues, they're connecting their learning to societal problems. And then we finally have what might be kind of the thing we're all after, which are civic gains and outcomes. And in this case, it's students' impressions of the extent to which the institution has contributed to their civic gains and outcomes. So there's a range of things we can ask students to reliably report on in terms of their experience. So these are the ones are the categories that currently represent the survey. And then in the next slide, I want to show you a couple of examples of what that data looks like. So for example, civic environment dimensions, I'm just going to show you a couple of things here. The first dimension is about students' belief or impressions that the institution emphasizes discussing important social, economic, and political issues. One of these key dimensions of the environment, how open and how many opportunities are there in the environment at your college or university to do these kinds of civic things. So a pretty good, almost half of seniors are indicating very much or quite a bit. And the next data point is, again, about half, 51% of seniors indicate that they feel encouraged to address. So another kind of dimension of the environment for civic discussion. 51% of seniors saying that. And then in the last dimension is that the institution emphasizes encouraging free speech and expression. And this one is slightly higher, so we could look at this as kind of good, better, best impressions here in terms of what students are experiencing in the environment. But this is a measure that could give both an institution a sense of what's the quality of our environment, that they might take action on to say, let's dig into this a little bit more and understand what contributes to these things. Or if they feel good about it, it could be something that they promote if it's particularly high, either in comparison to other institutions or perhaps as a target that they aspire to for their own quality of their civic environment. So those are dimensions that we already have. And what David and the group kind of inspired us to think about is how this maps to the new CLDE framework. So in the next slide, I've just started to demonstrate how the dimensions that David introduced map to survey items. So again, there's a correspondence here between color. So the purple represents the democratic knowledge, and in the items that pop up on the right-hand side, it is our association between the concepts and principles that David introduced us to and the items that reflect those principles. So I think there's some good mapping that would allow us to actually report out on some of these dimensions. So I think that's exciting. And I'll just share with you 2 final data points here that were reflected actually in the Every Student, Every Degree report that came out recently. And the first is about service learning participation. And sorry, again, this is on a new slide. So service learning participation, we know as a practical civic experience, about half of first-year students report doing this. This is one of our high impact practice measures that has increased over about the last 15 years progressively. It's really one of the main high impact practices that that has seen an increase. So clearly this is a practice that is picked up from a pedagogical perspective and something that institutions are investing in to reflect these greater proportions of students doing them. So 52% of first year students and 59% of seniors. It's actually been, up to 60% kind of this of seniors as well. And then the last dimension that I just want to indicate that I think is a really nice overarching one to keep track of is the extent to which students indicate that one of their gains and that the institution has contributed to this is being an informed and active citizen. It goes back to some of the things that are Deirdre and I don't know, we're talking about in terms of these larger civic principles, that being an informed and active citizen is something that we have as a democratic goal or an idea that higher education actually contributes to. And in this case, about 58% of seniors indicate substantial gains around those dimensions. I'd like to see more of students in that substantial band, and there might be some ways to think more intentionally about how we might track this and try and influence it in important ways. So that's all I have in terms of some of our new measures and what we might be able to assess. But I think this is a really exciting opportunity to really get at some measures that might help us both at an institution level better understand how we are addressing these democratic engagement goals, but then also how we can work to improve them.
Yeah,
Thanks.
that's really great. I'm really I think you hit it on the head with that last comment about this is something that we can actually start using now and then work with, and particularly I think one of the things is was mentioned in an earlier session about what's broadly called initiative fatigue. Oh, this is another thing. It's actually not another thing. It's merely a focus on an extension of a lot of what is already happening on campuses and what we want to see happen. I also, just my own comment, I think relating the qualitative comments to the measures is a potentially promising path whereby we can get a more accurate view of what's going on. Again, with Jillian's presentation, I would point you to the chat. Citizens and Scholars provides a catalog of 200 or more measures in this area, and AAC&U has, for now, it's at least a decade, probably 13 to 15 years, developed a set of value rubrics, and that is an attempt to develop rubrics that actually measure educational outcomes by examining student artifacts. And that project it's just proceeding along and may be a good complement to the more survey-based approaches. So and Jillian did mention CESI as well, that their website is worth looking, and particularly for community college folks who are in this session as a place to look for ways to start this kind of work. As we're really close on time now, what I'd like to do is ask the panelists, is there any moment that you're already having where you're thinking, oh, I should have said this, or oh, I forgot to mention that, or oh, or some reaction to what else was said by your co-panelist? I mean, I thought it was really quite complimentary. The need for research, for landscape analysis, and the realization that we've got a lot to work with, and then we also have a lot of needs. I think Charles' call about, and that report I will be looking forward to reading. So would anyone like to weigh in or ask a question or make a comment?
Well, I'll just make one quick comment to follow up on the invitation that Charles made at the beginning about the idea of corollaries that could reflect the ways that higher education supports democracy. And I hope many of you on the call today or on the Zoom here today saw some of those corollaries, or the potential for some of those corollaries in some of the data that we presented And, you know, to me, there's some real value in the idea of the number of graduates, the proportion of graduates that have completed their college degree having done a service learning experience, or the number who have done a civic activity in a course. I think those are things that could be promoted as good measures of practice, something that institutions could keep track of.
I had one thing, David.
Yeah.
I think, this isn't like a substantive ad, but I feel like there were like maybe 3 different dynamics that were hit upon by all of us as panelists that I think might be worth teasing out. So one is like using assessment and data here on the one hand for like where we need to do more research to better diagnose what's going on in student reality. And then the other that's more prescriptive for like, okay, well, once we know these things, how are we moving the needle? Because we know that we wanted to do that. We said we were going to do that. The second thing is like, I think you saw this kind of cascade through our presentations, but like different levels of metrics that we're talking about, right?
Mm.
Whether it's like classroom assessment all the way up to like the highest level in terms of like the point of higher ed and attainment. The third thing is this sort of bidirectionality between student success and civic learning and democracy engagement. One is like, the AAC and U report where it's like, how are we, and other reports that the panel has shared and discussed where it's how are these sorts of outcomes predictive of student success on the one hand, and then what I was kind of focusing more on, which is, how is student success when it's not happening, when our graduation rates are low, predictive of a democracy that's not going to work. So it might be helpful to think of those 3 different dynamics as we try to like organize our thoughts about this as a sector.
Yeah, and that last point goes to Joanna's point about the different sort of general framework perspectives about what the relationship is between civic education and democracy. And particularly the third one about it, well, it's just replicating. And that's always a question that higher education institutions have to think about, whether there's just repeating, social reproduction kind of phenomenon where class in, class out, essentially, that socioeconomic indicators and other indicators are more likely to be telling us more. But at the same time, I mean, I go back to Jillian's finding that I think the message is getting out there, and I think students are embracing the message. I mean, the qualitative comments are quite impressive. So with that, let me people who attended this session, if you have any advice for us, or if you have any ideas about assessment or know of any measures that you may certainly know some measures that you think we should think about and look at, please do send it to us, and any other later comments or questions. And so I want to thank you for attending, and I particularly want to thank our panelists for a great job in giving us different perspectives on it. So thank you, everybody. And I would remind you that there's going to be a 5-minute break now, and during that 5-minute break, you will see a scroll of our full participation institutions. One of the common questions when we describe this project to people is, well, who's doing it well? And the criterion currently that we are using is what institutions are configured such that a student can't escape having a civic education or democracy engagement experience. And these are some of the institutions you might identify with or know and might want to. And here too, if your institution you think is a full participation institution, contact us. Or if you want to recommend or nominate another institution, we'd appreciate that too. So,
David?
yeah.
Oh, sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to mention that we started a little early, but we actually have until 5:05. So if there are more questions, and then we'll have the 5-minute break till 5:10.
Oh, I thought the break was at 5.
Sorry about that.
Well, the floor is open. Can people in the audience unmic to ask a question or make a comment?
Yes, everyone should be able to unmute.
Floor is open.
David, it's
Oh, Nancy. Yeah.
So first of all, I wanted to thank the panelists. Fantastic discussion. I was very intrigued by Charles's last comment, and also Iana's analysis of the three sort of frameworks around the research that they did. Hold on, let me just get rid of my thing. So to Charles, it seems to me that your question about the revert, the if it doesn't happen, is our democracy going to be destroyed? Essentially, is a very strong argument for diversifying access to higher education in a way that is not culture specific or minority specific or color specific or whatever. It's actually flipping the argument that and we all know it's because it's to protect the democracy. But if we frame it the way you just did, that if we're not being effective, then we're at risk. And so we need to, get out of that sense of the trap of perpetuating the same socioeconomic, privilege. Anyway, so I just thought that was really useful, and we should think about that. To Iana's three categories of framing, I was really interested in the idea of the tools. I mean, we are essentially teaching the tools of democracy, literacy, as you described them, critical thinking, as you described it. That is what higher education is supposed to do. We teach the tools of democracy. And I think that it's, even more important than socializing people into democracy. Our job is to teach. We have to teach the content. We have to give people the critical thinking skills, whether that's through writing or math analysis or whatever. And it's not, to that point, we're not doing something different than we've always been doing, but we're framing it in sort of an essential requirement of higher education, at least, higher education's purpose. So I really liked, I thought that of the three that you gave us, the one that's the most obvious and sort of simplistic in some ways is potentially the one that we can lean into. But those are just my thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
I would
Yeah,
just,
to,
go ahead, please.
To kind of piggyback off of Charles's last point, right? Like that's kind of the starting paradox in a lot of this research, the fact that net everything else, historically, we have the most educated population around the globe at this point, but we also have pretty low levels of engagement in civil society and voting. So there's this paradox, right, of like, why is this sort of declining engagement, right? And Putnam has his whole theory about this, but I think that goes to Charles's point of like, if something is broken, if we're not looking into this in a deeper way, then of course it's going to have ramifications for democracy at large as well. So we need to look within higher education.
I was just going to add, I think there's probably a research component that needs to be done around, I don't know how to put this, but like, the theory of, okay, so if I'm, we know that, that lots of students, drop out before graduating, right? And like for Black students, as an example, for Black or African American students who drop out of college before getting their credential, who took out a student loan, half of them will default. And that if you default, you're going to have your wages garnished. And like, this is your interaction with the public sector. This is your interaction with the public system. Like, we need to track how these sorts of outcomes relate to things like voting and other aspects of engagement in a participatory democracy, because my hunch is that that sort of massive failure on higher ed's part, there's probably a direct causal line, and that research needs to be done.
Mm-hmm.
Lucas had a question. I wanted to ask about data and efforts in graduate education. I do not know the answer to that question. Maybe somebody else does.
I don't either, but that might have an important effect on how new faculty come into their jobs and think about this work. If they thought in terms of public service scholarship, for example.